Well, that was unexpected. A reference to Peter. Peter is a unique young man. I don't know that I've ever been around a child quite like Peter. Love all of our 9 grandchildren. Peter has a special place in my heart. He's my boy. Some wonderful memories of when they were still living in Wheaton, and Peter was just this little guy, and I could tell you some wonderful Peter stories that would it last from us all, but also warm your heart for this young man. He touches my heart. Thank you for this opportunity to come and hang out with you for this conference. It's a privilege to be here and to have you folks gather and to be talking about and thinking about the kinds of things to which I've really dedicated my entire public ministry. And that is, in one form or another, things relating to the communication of biblical truth. Communicating God's Word. Whether it's in the form of preaching, I did a doctorate at Purdue in the field of communication, which covers everything from, well, intrapersonal, much less interpersonal, and then, small group and public address, mass communication. You kind of go the whole range. But it was all focused on, the reason I did that was because the subject of communication fascinates me. Human communication, extremely complex and interesting and always new and changing and challenging, this thing that we do and take for granted all day, every day, communicating with one another. If you really stop and start taking it apart and realize the complexity of what we're doing, it really is astonishing, the subject of human communication. But I went there not only because of that interest, it was because of wanting to teach in this area, particularly at a theological seminary level. Well, I no sooner finished that program, but the Lord put me in a pastorate where I was out there doing it, and then wound up after some years of doing it in a local church as a pastor, back teaching for a decade on a seminary faculty in the field of communication, but focused about 75% of my teaching was in the area of communicating the scriptures in the form of doing expository preaching. And then the rest of my teaching was in other areas of communication relating to ministry. So this is a subject that is near and dear to my heart, and frankly, even I went on and later did another program overseas at Oxford. It was also in the same area, in an area that is fascinating to me and that the Lord put me onto early on in my ministry, early on in this I wound up doing a piece of research there that I wanted to do back at Purdue, and they wouldn't let me do it because it's a secular university, and this was about the theology of preaching, and it required working in the primary research materials of ancient Greece and the New Testament, and there was no one at the secular university who had the expertise to supervise that, so they wouldn't let me do it. So I wound up doing it later, going over to England and doing it, spending those years at Oxford University, pursuing this particular piece of research, of which you are going to be receiving the fruit, or at least sort of a key centerpiece of that research as we come today, and we find ourselves focusing on what we are not doing when we're communicating a message. The not there is very functional. What we were doing yesterday was focused on what we are doing when we come and communicate. And we zeroed in on the theme of this conference, that is speaking the truth in love. That's what we're doing. It's a verbal behavior. It's speaking. We're speaking the truth, capital T truth, God's truth. And we're called upon to do it whoever we're talking to, from our children as we're raising them, teaching a Sunday school class, standing in a pulpit, sharing with a neighbor, a coworker, trying to communicate with those who oppose us and consider us their enemies. In other words, Jesus says to love your enemies. We don't look at them as enemies. We disagree with them, but they're not our enemies. But they view us as their enemy, and they want to bring us down if they can. Well, how do you communicate? How do you speak the truth in love to them? Christ calls us to love your enemies. Do good to them. Pray for them. Bless them. How do we do that in this day and age? We live in a culture that plays down the role of the verbal, doesn't really trust language to carry theological truth. It doesn't believe in capital T truth. It's you have your truth and I have my truth. We all have our truths. But what about capital T truth that is true for all of us, no matter what I think or see, this is true. That kind of truth, our society doesn't have much time for that. That's what you have in the scriptures. Capital T truth, God's truth. And so you come and you have a message. It's a verbal message. You put it into words. You can't communicate it any other way, the gospel. And you're communicating this into the culture that doesn't believe in capital T truth. And even some out there who you try to do that and they will censure you for it. Who do you think you are that you think you have the truth that you're going to try to impose upon me? That whole thing that we see in our culture because of the worldview that's now dominating our culture. And it is into that world that we are called to speak the truth in love. And that's what we're doing. It's really what the conference is about. So that was yesterday. We were focusing on that whole piece of what we are doing. Today I want to look at what we are not doing. What we are not doing, if I would just put it, stated very simply, is in communicating the truth in this culture. I'm wrestling with whether to touch this now or wait and get into it. Let me just kind of say it here. This is what we are not doing is sort of a battle of the wills in communicating with our audience. This is not a case where we have to gear up and get the job done and be successful in accomplishing what we're after with our audience. That is not our task. And there are a lot of people who think it is. There are a lot of people in the field of preaching, homiletics, teaching this, and somehow this is viewed as a challenge of how you can win the day in communicating with your preaching audience. And I want to back up and say, wait, that is not a healthy way for us to be thinking about what our task is in this business of communicating the truth to our day and our age, to the people we're talking to. We want to turn that around and refocus how we understand what it is we are doing. But in order to do that, we have to get a glimpse of what we're not doing. In order to do that, we're going to be turning to 1 Corinthians. Like I say, I spent a lot of time focused on this. This is two books, really, that are focused on what I'm talking about here this morning. The one was really the publishing of the Oxford dissertation, and that's this one with Cambridge University Press. And then a few years ago, I revised it all and brought it all up to date and expanded it in ways that you can't do in an academic book like that one, because the academic publishers, that's not what they want. This one is with University Press, and it takes all of this and brings it home with regard to actual ministry. And what I want to say to you is that these books are about a complete shift in a philosophy of ministry. What we're talking about here today is we want to examine a major insight for Christian ministry. What we're after this morning is an entire philosophy of ministry for whatever ministry we're doing. For us as individuals, for a whole church. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 1 through 4, applies this ministry insight to his preaching ministry. But in the end, as we'll see, it applies to all of our ministry. It is a philosophical philosophy of ministry that is a profound shift from what we're typically, I shouldn't say typically, that's too harsh. What we often will find as people understand the ministry of a church or individual ministry, there is what I call the natural paradigm, and then we are going to explore this morning, in contrast to that, the Pauline paradigm. the natural model, and the Pauline model. Well, let's begin with this. We're going to plunge into 1 Corinthians 1 through 4. Actually, we're going to look at chapter 1 and a little bit into chapter 2. We can't do all of 1 Corinthians 1 through 4, but that section hangs together. In other words, Paul is talking about, in that section, the focus of it is preaching. He'd been criticized for his preaching in Corinth. The Corinthians were unhappy with him, and this is his response after leaving Corinth, writing back to them, defending what he did and why he did it the way he did it. And he articulates in this 1 Corinthians 1 through 4, this in a whole philosophy of ministry, but he brings that philosophy of ministry to bear on his preaching ministry. And that's what we're going to look at this morning. So in a moment, we're going to turn to the text of 1 Corinthians. But let me give a bit of background. First of all, a background about ancient rhetoric. Now, this is really important. This is really what I was studying. The whole program at Purdue was called rhetorical studies. And today, the word rhetoric is not really understood. It's a negative term for us. In our society, that's mere rhetoric. That's just empty verbiage. People don't like the word rhetoric. It's a shame because rhetoric has a long and very noble tradition behind it. In the ancient world, and that's what we're going to be talking about, and certainly was true in ancient Corinth, ancient rhetoric was the crown of a liberal education. For truly educated people, you did all the lower stuff. If you think in terms of the Roman trivium, for example, you have the logic and grammar and so on. But eventually you get in the latter part and toward the end of your education, if you're a truly educated person, it all comes together in what's called the architectonic study of the entire liberal arts program of the ancient world from which we get our whole liberal arts mindset and education. The architectonic that put it all together was the study of rhetoric. It wasn't about empty verbiage, purple prose kind of thing. Rhetoric is where it all came together. Quintilian, the first century contemporary of the Apostle Paul, the leading teacher of rhetoric in Rome, he wrote this 12-volume Institutes of Oratory, the training of an orator from birth almost, you would think. It just goes on and on. It's very detailed, long. This was the epitome of it. He talks about the point of rhetoric. The goal is a good man speaking well. In other words, a person of integrity, of quality, well-educated, articulate, speaking well with substance, with really quality content coming from a quality person, delivered powerfully and eloquently, the wise man speaking well. That combination was the orator that they were looking for. And in that ancient world, in ancient Corinth, this was the mark of an educated person, a person who could do that. This was the road to power and influence, those who could do this well. This was the primary entertainment in ancient Greco-Roman world, Greek and then into the Roman Empire. These orators, those who could do this well, they really became the movie stars of their day. There were no movies, no newspapers, no television, no radio, no internet, no anything. What did people have for entertainment? Well, you say, well, how about Greek drama? Really, Greek drama was largely for the elites. The average person didn't really partake of much. They couldn't do it, didn't have it accessible, couldn't afford it. The primary entertainment, so to speak, if you think in terms of who were the celebrities of the day, it was for the oratory, the orators, the ones who were trained in ancient rhetoric and were the best at it. They would sweep into town, and it really was. We don't have anything like this today of what these people could really do. They really were brilliant. They could sweep into town and carry people away with their speeches. They would often get into a situation where they would just say a topic, and call for a topic from the audience. And they would step back and think about that topic, and they would begin to speak. And it was amazing what would come out, their level of knowledge and their ability to communicate, put it into words with power and beauty, and to deliver it. And just they could do it impromptu. They were polymaths. They could know everything. Back then, there wasn't nearly as much to know as there is now. And there would be people who could speak about philosophy and music and history and art and politics, and they could do it off the top. And they could do it powerfully. We just don't have anything like that. It's a dying art. In any case, the people who could do that were the celebrities of their day. They were the orators, were the movie stars of their day. And the people, the ordinary people, loved to talk about their favorite ones and compare and contrast the orators. You always, when you stood up as an orator, you stood up in order to be tested. You were going to be reviewed, the audience, and the audience was the ultimate measure of your success. And your ability to move them was the measure of your success. And their approbation was what we're after. And frankly, audiences were very discerning. And if you didn't please them, if you didn't move them, if you were unconvincing to them, and they let you know it. And that was devastating to the orators. I could quote from the ancient literature. These books are about 5 centuries worth of Greco-Roman secular authors writing about rhetoric and its function within the Greek and in the Roman culture. Anyway, these orators were the movie stars of their day, all across the Greek and then the Roman Empire. This is ancient rhetoric. Again, it was what the education system was aiming for, was a person who could do this sort of thing. And when they could do it well, it was a truly impressive thing. And it could be abused, it could be misused, but it was also, when it was at its best, it was a very noble thing. It was a very impressive thing. You and I, if we heard it done, we would be impressed by it if we heard it done by the ones who could do it well. So it's a shame to lose the word rhetoric, and it's a negative thing now, but back then it was, and for most of Western history, it's the study really of the art of effective communication and powerful communication. These people were persuaders and very powerful persuaders, these orators. They could hold the audience in the palm of their hand. They could make them weep. They could make them laugh. They could convince them, get them to do what they wanted to do, vote in a particular way or whatever it would be. Well, ancient rhetoric played that role, and it's something, it's sort of a lost awareness that a lot of us have today. This was true in ancient Corinth. Ancient Corinth was well known for how it revered its orators, and there's documentation for that. It's here in the book. As the ancient Corinthians were especially enamored of these powerful, eloquent speakers. Corinth was an interesting city. 150 years or so before Christ, it had been razed to the ground by the Romans. It was a Greek city, but they devastated it. They pretty much flattened it, and it was uninhabited. But 100 years later, about 50 years before the time of Christ, Julius Caesar went and took this location of Corinth and brought it back to life as a Roman colony. Now it's still in Greece. In fact, it's right at the crossroads, north, south, east, west, right there on the isthmus between the Peloponnesus and the rest of Greece up above. And there's a very narrow isthmus. There's a canal through there now to make east-west traffic possible. There was no canal at that point, but they used to, at that point in the olden days, they would actually take a ship and bring it in on the one side and haul it across and put it in the sea on the other, because this narrow isthmus was easier to do that than it was to sail all the way down and around and back up. Plus, the sea was dangerous down there. So Corinth was right at that isthmus. Going from north to south, you had to go through Corinth. And going east to west and overland, you had to go through Corinth. It was a crossroads of the Greco-Roman world. If any city in the ancient world could bear the Greco-Roman, Greek, but also Roman, it was Corinth. And it was a place of commerce. It was famous for its licentiousness, probably over-famous, modern scholarship says, because the truth of the matter, it probably wasn't any more licentious than any other major port city. It was licentious, but so were the others. Having said that, it was a place of prosperity. There was a Jewish sub-community there. We know there was a synagogue there at the time of the first century. So it is that the city of ancient Corinth loved the rhetoricians, revered them, had a library where they put bronze statues of the leading orators out on the front row. I mean, they loved the orators. And then we come to the Apostle Paul and his experience in Corinth. You'll remember if you're reading the book of Acts, Acts chapter 16, 17, 18, Paul's on his second missionary journey, and he goes across into Asia Minor, and he says, Luke tells us that he was inclined to go north. It's like over in Turkey, that area. And the Lord comes to him and says, no, Paul, I want you to go east. I want you to, go west, over into Europe. First time we ever get the gospel that we're aware of over into what we think of as now Southern Europe, Greece. So they go across and they go into Philippians, into Philippi. Remember Paul's experience in Philippi. Well, he's almost killed, dragged out of the city, almost died, preaches the gospel there, but leaves behind a little fledgling church. He goes on to Thessalonica. What happens in Thessalonica? Well, the critics from Philippi, the echoes of that are still with him. Now he goes to Thessalonica and has a disastrous experience in Thessalonica there as well. Nevertheless, leaves behind the little fledgling church. Goes on from there to Berea. And there we find the book of Acts says the Bereans were more noble than the rest because they tested the scriptures to see whether these things be true. What a wonderful line that is. The Bereans, actually hearing the Apostle Paul proclaim Christ, proclaim the gospel, all they had was the Old Testament. But he comes and proclaims the gospel. I say the Jews had the Old Testament. The Thessalonians who were not Jewish didn't even have that. But Paul was coming and bringing this new thing, the gospel of the Christ resurrected, the account of the resurrection. They were more noble than the rest because they tested the scriptures, the Jews did, the Old Testament record, to see whether these things be true. There's a sense in which the Bereans are a model for all of us. How do we decide what's true? Well, for those of us who have the inscripturated revelation that we see as our rule of faith and practice, our faith, what we believe, our practice, what we do, this is the rule, we bring everything to the bar of Scripture. We're like the Bereans. We say, well, that's really interesting. Let's see, what does the Bible say about that? We test the Scriptures to see whether these things be true. Well, the Bereans did that even to the apostle. And they're affirmed for that in the book of Acts. Anyway, but Paul goes to Berea, and you remember he has a very bad experience there. The Thessalonian opponents come and follow him there and wind up driving him out of the city, and he slinks away to Athens. He goes to Athens, and now you have this whole experience on Mars Hill where he comes in, and now he's at the pinnacle of Greek society. In fact, the intellectual pinnacle of the entire Greco-Roman world was Athens, and famous for it, going all the way back for the previous 300, 400, 500 years. You're going there, and then you went to Mars Hill, where this is the gathering of the intellectual elite, the philosophers and so on. He was in the marketplace and astonished by people, but now he goes up onto Mars Hill, and he goes before, it's like going before the Harvard faculty. You say this is a gathering of the elite intellectual leadership of the world, really, certainly of Europe, certainly of Greece. Well, there he goes, and you have this famous speech in Acts chapter 17 of Paul on Mars Hill. And he brings to them a sort of toned down version of the gospel. It's almost a sort of pre-evangelism. He didn't give a full gospel presentation, at least according to the record that we have in Acts 17, which probably is it has to be pretty much a shortened version, a glimpse of what he did, because you can read it within just a couple of minutes. And he was obviously speaking for longer than just a couple of minutes. But you have there the essence of what the Apostle Paul said on Mars Hill to these. And he brings to them the notion of the resurrection, but he does not really give a full orb, what we think of as the full measure of the gospel, according to Acts chapter 17. Well, these people were very skeptical and gave him a very poor hearing. Paul gets rejected by this group of elites. He's called a spermologos, it's a literally seed picker. but it's reference to like birds in the gutter, going picking up seeds. That's what he's done. He's this traveler, a little short, not very attractive, Jewish itinerant speaker, proclaiming these strange things about somebody who was resurrected. And he's dismissed as a seed picker, not someone to be taken seriously. Now, the Apostle Paul was a man of great intellect and strength and courage. And this was, I think this was very difficult for the Apostle Paul. One of the reasons you say that is this elite, after the Apostle Paul spoke and they give him this negative reaction, there were a few who actually embraced the gospel there. A few believed and they responded well. But the rest said, we will hear this fellow again. So Paul gets a little bit of results, positive results, a lot of negative results, and they say, well, at least we'll give him another hearing. And what comes next? Paul leaves Athens and goes to Corinth. Say, wait, Paul, what are you doing? He did not leave behind in Athens a church. In all these other difficult cities, he left behind the seed that grew into a church. Believers who there became a little pocket and grew a church. Not in Athens. No Pauline church in Athens. Despite the fact they said we'd hear you again. Now, Paul leaves. And you can almost see him with his tail between his legs. This has been a tough run. The Lord had called him over, said, no, I want you to go this way. Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, now Athens. And he's got his tail between his legs, walking this short distance, really probably a matter of 20, 30 miles, to Corinth. And so he goes into Corinth. And what happens in Corinth? He goes to the synagogue, and he's preaching the gospel there, and they kick him out of the synagogue. And, of course, not before he gets hauled before the Roman governor, Gallio, who hears what this stupid thing is about. The Jews who are opposing him bring him before Gallio and want the Roman governor to do something. And Gallio says, get out of here. I don't even want to hear you, guy. This is your business, not mine. This doesn't have anything to do with Rome. You solve this yourself. Get out of my face. It was a very negative response. And here is the Apostle Paul. Some had believed, and the Corinthian church was founded, but it was a difficult church right from the beginning. And it is this is something we don't realize, I think, many of us, for whom Paul is probably I was asking Reed this morning over breakfast. Only he and I were down. I said, Reed, who's your favorite figure in the Bible after Jesus? Who's your favorite? And he thought for a few minutes, and he says, I think the Apostle Paul. I said, Reed, I agree with you. Paul is my favorite character as well. I really identify with him and admire him for his courage, his stamina, for his dedication. Well, here he comes, the great Apostle Paul, indefatigable. Just, you can't stop this guy. Except after this march through Greece, down to Athens, and ultimately to Corinth, and all the problems in Corinth, the great Apostle Paul was ready to quit. And it was in Corinth that the Lord appears to him and says, Paul, don't stop speaking. I have many people here. Apparently, the Apostle Paul had come pretty much to the end of his rope, and it happened in Corinth. It's a very difficult circumstance. Well, all of that is the background of the Apostle Paul and Corinth, and so he finishes in Corinth, founds a church. There's plenty of problems there, and he knows there's problems there. Later he leaves, he's in Ephesus, and he hears these accounts from messengers about what's going on. He gets these reports about what's going on in the Corinthian church. And you have him now responding in 1 Corinthians. Turn in your Bibles, if you would, to 1 Corinthians. Before we look at Paul's response, because, again, we're heading for this really life-changing, church-changing, personal ministry-changing insight for ministry. that certainly applies to our communication of biblical truth, but it really applies to all of our ministry. But before we do that, I want to take a quick rabbit trail. This is too good to pass up. After Paul's very difficult experience in Corinth, the low point of his whole ministry. In this research, I ran across this thing in the most obscure place you'd ever find it. I'd never seen it referred to anyplace else, buried. In 2007, the modern city of Corinth, today, convened an international conference on the subject of St. Paul and Corinth. 2 years later, the city published the conference papers, in the prologue of which we read this. The time came finally for Corinth to fulfill its great debt. A spiritual debt to Paul, the apostle to all nations, the apostle that opened up the horizon of the divine revelation for the city and also endowed the city with so much prestige with his presence that Corinth is today known everywhere in the world, mainly through Paul's work and his extremely significant epistles to the Corinthians. Can you imagine if Paul could have looked forward for 2,000 years and seen that? The entire city saying, we are known around the world because of this guy. This guy who stood there being disdained by the Roman governor, by being trashed by the Corinthians in general and mistreated by the Corinthian church, criticized his ministry, his speaking, his appearance. Haddon Robinson used to say, I've heard him say it on a number of occasions, using this example of Paul and Corinth. Here's Gallio representing Nero at the time, the emperor who was a god, considered a god, the emperor worship. And talking about, how the Lord uses, as we will see in a moment as we read this passage, how the Lord uses things that the world considers low status, considers nothing, unimpressive. Those are the things God delights in using to accomplish his purposes in the world so that nobody can boast. That's one of the statements in the Bible about the ways of God. Have you ever thought about studying the Bible to draw out all the places where the Bible tells us about the ways? This is how God works in the world. He chooses, this is one of them. God chooses to use the things that are low status in the eyes of the world to accomplish his purpose so that no man. Haddon used to speak about that, Paul, in his comment. I've never forgotten it because he says, today, here was Paul, they're nobody. Here's the emperor, Nero. He said, and today, we name our dogs Nero, and we name our sons Paul. Well, again, Paul is a hero of mine, and so this study has only reinforced that, all the time spent looking at all of this. I want you to look with me at chapter 1, and we're going to pick up, we'll pick up, say, verse 14. Paul's talking about his ministry in Corinth, and he's zeroing in on his preaching ministry, and that's what this 1 through 4 is going to be about, and it surfaces right here at the beginning where he's talking about his ministry. I didn't baptize. Oh yeah, excuse me, I forget. I did baptize the household of Stephanus. And beyond that, I don't really remember whether I baptized anyplace else. Because here's the point: Christ didn't send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. The verb here, to preach, is a very important one. The word preach doesn't really do it justice. To proclaim gets closer in the English to what the English is, what the Greek is. The Greek verb is keruso. It's the verb that comes from, that is related to the Greek word for the herald, the kerux. Keruso is to herald something, to announce something, to testify to something. He says, Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, to herald the gospel, to announce the gospel, not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. What empties the cross of its power? Well, you'll see in a moment. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. If you're not a Calvinist when you start studying this, you'll be one when you finish. That reference to those who are perishing versus those who are being saved. God is in the process of saving his elect. We get off into the doctrine of election. It's complicated, can't go there now, but you're not going to make sense of Paul. I'm a Calvinist, not because of Calvin, but because of Paul. For though the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. What is the power? The power is the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. That is the power. For it is written, and he cites Isaiah, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. This is a theme of the Bible all the way, Old Testament, New Testament. So looking at the world in the light of this, and especially in Corinth, where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe, the intellect, the educated person? Where is the debater of this age, the one who can stand up and debate you and defeat you? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through, and you almost need to supply the word it's, through its wisdom, through the wisdom the world takes for granted, its ability to climb the hill, the intellectual hill, rise to the top, couldn't get to God through that means. It pleased God through the folly of what we preach. And the folly here, and so one of the themes of these books, is not just, the folly is not just what we preach, the cross of Christ. Okay, that is scandalous, as we hear in a moment. But the folly is simply to come and announce that. You're a testifier to it. You're a herald of that truth. Oh wait, we expect powerful argument. We expect eloquence. You expect me to believe you if you can't demonstrate for me? The word apodeixis is a crucial one in the rhetorical literature because that's what the orator does. Go back and read Aristotle's Rhetoric, a whole book that he wrote, in effect, on the subject of ancient rhetoric. And he says the centerpiece of what the persuader does is to demonstrate in the minds through logos, pathos, ethos, through these different logical argument, emotional argument, whatever it takes to demonstrate before their mind so that they see it and they embrace it. You have to demonstrate to your audience the truth of this. The Apostle Paul says God chose in his great wisdom not to use that whole system, but rather through the folly of what is announced, the preached word to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and a folly to the Gentiles. The Jews looked at it as scandalous, this notion of a man dying on a cross is our salvation. The Greeks look at it and says, get out of my face, that's ridiculous, it's nonsense. We expect this other kind of wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to the Gentiles, but to those who are called, to those who are being saved, to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, this gospel message of Jesus Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. All of this deserves comment, but we're going to run out of time, so I'm going to keep going. For consider your calling. Let me give you an example. Look at yourselves. Look in the mirror, Corinthians. For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you are wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many of noble birth. But God chooses what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chooses what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chooses what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. That's a profound insight into how God works in the world, one that we all need to keep in mind. It's humbling because if you belong to him, you're numbered among the lowly. It's a good reminder, though, and one that we all need to keep in mind. God delights in using the things the world considers low status to accomplish his purposes in the world. He is the source of your life in Christ, whom God made to be our wisdom and our righteousness, our sanctification, redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. Don't you try to take credit for it. It is what God is doing in his using of the things that the world considers low status. And of course, the gospel is in that category. The gospel of Christ and him crucified. Very low status, especially in that world. We could go into that. The mentality of the Greek and then the Romans and what they expected to be impressed by, who they would be impressed by. The man hanging on the cross does not, for either Jew or Greek, for different reasons, qualify at all. It was an embarrassing message to have to preach to these secularists. And now we come to this key passage, the last 5 verses we'll look at. Chapter 2 and verse 1. And when I came to you, brothers, I didn't come to you proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. This is what you're used to. High-powered oratory. That's not what you got from me when I came among you. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. What do you think Paul means by I decided this? You can overstate this, but his experience in Athens was such a miserable experience of standing and speaking to this. And there are people who will argue that he tried something there and failed before the elite there on Mars Hill. I think that goes too far. I think he recognized some things there that reminded him of who he is and what he's doing as he's trudging to Corinth from Athens. And he says, I decided to know among you nothing. I wasn't going to do anything except I was going to proclaim to you the crucified Christ. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. The very thing that the orator said, you're dead in the water if you're standing before an audience looking like that, communicating that. You go nowhere. You have no success. No orator can be successful unless he is super confident standing in front of an audience. I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. And my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in the apodoxis of the Spirit. Apodoxis was what rhetoric was all about, but it was a very different human apodoxis. Human psychology, the power that we can generate in and of ourselves. It's a very powerful thing. And in other settings, say an orator, a politician, a lawyer before a jury, in our days, advertisers, it can be very powerful. Paul says, I came to you, and the apodoxis that I provided was the Spirit of God. I don't think he means by that he was doing miracles or even speaking in tongues or that kind of thing. This was the conviction that you came to was because the Spirit of God did this in your heart. You heard the gospel. Instead of rejecting it, you heard it and said, yes. That's the Spirit of God turning on inside you. Those of you who are being saved, you hear the gospel and you're ready for it because the Spirit of God has made you ready for it and you embrace it. It's the demonstration of the Spirit and power in order that your faith might not rest on the wisdom of men, but the power of God. That is Paul's key argument here, and it leads us then to a very important insight, a very important discussion. Boy, I've got a Mach schnell, as the Germans say. I want to take us to a basic insight so we can see what Paul is saying here and get to this ministry insight. If you look at the grand equation of rhetoric, you have the audience. Who you get is your audience. That's who you get. You can't change that. Your efforts, when applied to that audience, lead to some sort of results. Now, that's the basic pieces of the equation we're talking about. Now, let's look at this. This is the independent variable. We're talking about the natural model, and the rhetoric is an example of the natural model, the persuader's model. You start with results. You say, okay, what is it we want to achieve? That's where you start in this equation. And then you move from there to the dependent variable, and that is, this depends on who is your audience and what are you trying to achieve with them, and that shapes all of this. This says, and you've got to be able to adjust your efforts with this audience to get this result. And if you do, you get the credit for it. If you don't, you failed. It's results driven. It starts with results. The grand equation, the natural model. This is the most common thing in the world. We do it all day, every day. Businessmen do it, lawyers do it, politicians do it, everybody. We begin by saying, okay, what do I want to achieve here? What am I trying to do here? All right, now, what do I have to do to make that happen? That's the most natural thing in the world. It's not sinful. Well, it can be, but it's not inherently sinful. We do it every day. What is it I'm trying to do here? Okay, now what do I have to do to make that happen? It's the natural model. It's what the natural man, how the natural person operates. But now I want you to contrast that with the Apostle Paul. We move to the Apostle Paul's model. Instead of this being an independent or a dependent variable, in other words, this is what changes in order to get this result. What Paul does is he says, I came among you knowing nothing but Christ and him crucified. Everywhere I go, basically, if you keep pursuing the Apostle Paul on this subject, he's basically saying the constant is the gospel. Christ and him crucified. Paul's like the rhetoricians. You can't change, you can't dictate who your audience is. Your audience is who it is. But the rest of it is flexible. So for Paul, this is not a variable at all. It's a constant, the gospel. I preach Christ and him crucified. He comes and introduces to the equation the gospel. So what's the variability? Well, the variability is over here on the results end. This is the dependent variable. The results. And you can see that in the Apostle Paul. He introduces the gospel into the Corinthian situation. And he talks about the variability of the results. And he says to them, look, this is the way this works. To the Jew, they find this message scandalous. To the Greek, they find it nonsense. But to those who are being saved, that same message is the power of God unto salvation. My job, my calling, is to introduce the gospel, to do what I've been called to do, to fulfill my calling. And I have to leave the results up to the Lord. You say, what is it then that produces the results? If Paul introduces the constant, the gospel, what dictates what the results will be? What the Spirit of God is doing. It's something outside the equation altogether. And Paul is willing to be faithful in doing his part, fulfilling his calling, and leaving the results up to the Lord. And so what you're left with, he actually, before we bring this to a close, we need to see, and if we have more time, I'll pursue this. Over in chapter 4, the latter part of this whole section, chapters 1 through 4, this is how one should regard us. As servants of Christ, stewards of the mystery of God. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. Here is where he takes this basic principle and moves it off of specifically his preaching and that he's defending himself to the Corinthians, and bumps it out to the principle that informs all of this. It is required of a steward to be found faithful. We have a calling. God has given us that stewardship of this calling. We are to be faithful in that. And the old line is, it's become a cliche, but it's true. We're not called to be successful. We're called to be faithful. Be faithful in what Christ has called us to do and leave the results up to him. So what you wind up with is two models. The natural model is results-driven. The Pauline model is obedience-driven. In other words, that is a profound shift. It's like looking two different ends of the telescope. You get two very different views. The natural model, the one that comes natural to us all, is to say, here's what we're trying to pull off. Now, what do we have to do to make that happen? Versus the Apostle Paul, which is obedience-driven. The question he asks is not, what are we trying to pull off? What he asks is, what is Christ calling me to be? What is he calling me to do? I'm going to do that and be that to the best of my ability, and I will leave the results up to him. That's an obedience-driven model. That's true for you. It's true for me as a preacher. It's true for churches. It's true for a place like Wheaton College. That is a profound shift in how we think about ministry. We don't start by saying, what are we after? We want the Bible church to be such and such a size 5 years from now. Now, what do we have to do to pull that off? Dangerous way to go about ministry. So easy to have the tail wag the dog. That result begins to dictate all kinds of things. Instead, what we need to be doing is saying, here we are a church. We're a church the Lord has planted here. Why did he raise up this church? What does he call us to be? What does he call us to do? How does he call us to operate together? How does he call us to, and we're trying to be faithful and obedient to his calling. And whatever the numbers are 5 years from now, that's what they'll be. But we'll be able to stand before the Lord and say, Lord, we were doing everything we knew how to do to be faithful to your calling on us, our hearts, our ministry, and our service. Well, that's a profound paradigm shift in how we think about it. It changes how we set our goals. We set our goals now in terms of obedience. What is he calling us to be? What is he calling us to do? Let's be that and do that to the best of our ability and leave the results up to the Lord. That's a very different way of entering the equation. We come to a third that puts a lot of weight on understanding one's calling. And I think we need to, as a church, as the body of Christ, we need to spend more time thinking about what it means to talk about our calling, whether as individuals. We all have a calling just because we are believers, but each one of us should think in terms of having, in addition, some unique calling, unique giftedness for us. What is Christ calling me to be? How is he calling me to do? How is he calling me to serve him? But that's true for churches as well. What is the calling of the Bible church? How do we understand who we are, why Christ has us here, what he calls us to be and do as a church? What kind of a place should we be if we are being faithful to Christ? And instead of a results-driven model, we're working off an obedience-driven model. And then finally, well, as I say, this applies to churches and organizations as well. And then finally, the Pauline model is both counterculture and counterintuitive. In the end, however, it is wonderfully liberating. And it really is. When you get to this obedience model, rather than, you're not driven by results anymore, you're shaken free of that success-driven model, and you're defining, you still need to be successful, but you're defining success in terms of the calling, what Christ is calling us to be and do. And we will be successful if we hear from him, a well done, thou good and faithful servant. That's how we measure success. We don't measure it by results. We measure it by obedience. And that is a profoundly different principle. But as I say, it's very liberating. In fact, I want to introduce you something, what I call the Nehemiah principle, taken, of course, from the book of Nehemiah. And here's something that is a bit shocking at first and when you think about it, but it's extremely liberating. A need is not a call. The Nehemiah principle goes back to, of course, the person of Nehemiah. Remember, he had this huge task. The walls of Jerusalem were flat, and he had to bring the walls up, do it quickly because of the opponents. Nobody thought he could do it. But what he did was to assign different families, clans, individuals, and so on, parts of the wall. And each one built its part of the wall. And lo and behold, the wall went up. Surprised everybody, including Nehemiah. I call this the Nehemiah principle. Basically, the Lord has the entire wall, and he's building the wall, and he's called us to be a part of that. He's given you a part of the wall. And what you have to ask is, what is my part of the wall? What is he calling me to be? What is he calling me to do? What is given who I am, my gifts, his calling on my life, us together? What is our part of the wall? We can't build the whole wall. That is something only God can do. The amount of human need, there are people getting burned out every day by seeing the amount of human need. We see more of it today than ever before in history. We see need everywhere we look. And if people are in the business of responding and feeling guilty if they don't respond, every time they see a need, you're dead. You're not going to make it. You're going to burn out. Churches will burn out. If you think every time you see a need, that's a call, and I've got to rise to that, you can't. You have to leave it up to the Lord. What you have to do is the Nehemiah principle says, The Lord doesn't call you to do it all. You can't do it all. Only God can do it all, and it's pretentious to think every time we see a need, we're supposed to be there. No, you've got to learn how to say no to good and important things in order to say yes to what Christ has called you to do. This is not a way to get out of sacrificial ministry. In fact, it's the opposite. You give yourself sacrificially to the part of the wall that God has given you. So you're constantly asking, Lord, what is our part of the wall? Every time I see a need, I can't rise up and feel guilty if I don't try to meet it. Sometimes, often these days, I have to look at things and just simply say, that is a really important need. They're doing a great job. That's not my part of the wall. I can't do that. Because I have to focus on what Christ has called me to do, and I can't get distracted away from that. And getting clear, that's why I say it puts a lot of weight on this notion of calling. What is our calling? What is our part of the wall? What is it we are to give ourselves sacrificially to, everything we have, to build that part of the wall? What God is doing all around the world, I can't do it all, but we can do. You can't do everything, you can do something. What is the something God is calling us to do? That is the Nehemiah principle. It is so liberating. It rids you of false guilt. There's nothing worse than false guilt. Real guilt serves a purpose. False guilt doesn't serve any purpose at all. And there's a lot of false guilt because people see needs and they think it's a need, it's a genuine need, I can see that, and I feel guilty if I don't rise to it. You say, wait a second, and maybe the Lord's calling you to rise to it, and you should rise to that. Maybe that's part of the, you have to decide. What is he calling you to do? What is he calling you to be? Do that, be that to the best of your ability. Be obedient to his calling. That's the Pauline model. Stop being driven by results. That's the most natural thing in the world. We all think that way. It's not inherently evil. It's just natural. You go on and read in chapter 2, the difference between the natural man and the spiritual man. There's lots of things that are natural. They're perfectly natural. It doesn't mean they're evil, but they're natural. It's our natural bent. But we are to operate on a spiritual basis. And the spiritual basis is recognize what Christ has called us to be and do, and then being that to the best of our ability. Serving Christ, building our part of the wall as best we can understand what that is, and leaving the rest up to the Lord and being relaxed in that while we are in the process of being faithful. Huge paradigm shift in how we do ministry. From a results-driven, here's what we want to achieve now. What do we all have to do to get that done? To an obedience-driven, what is he calling us to do and be as a church, as individuals? Now, how can I be that and do that as faithfully as I possibly can? And in the end, knowing that if I do that, I will hear, well done, thou good and faithful servant. You were obedient. The Apostle Paul says, I wasn't called to do these other things. He called me to do this particular thing. I want to do it to the best of my ability, and I will leave the results up to him. I'm not going to try to make this happen. I'm not responsible to make it happen. I don't come with cleverness of speech or persuasive words of wisdom. Lest your faith rest on the wisdom of man. My horsepower is a speaker, rather than the genuine work of the Spirit of God. That's the paradigm shift that you have. And it's profoundly liberating and freeing in ministry. I highly recommend it to you. Bless you. Thanks.